see it. I can't see anybody at the moment, so if someone could just say yes or no, that would be fantastic.
Yes, we can see.
Yes, all right, great. Thank you very much. So to begin, scholars from the Hellenistic period to the modern day have spilt much ink over the true fate of the Phaeacians at their city Scheria, which Odyssey Book 13 leaves unresolved. The debate largely centers around a single editorial concern over line 168. In the version upheld by the majority of current publications of the Odyssey, found in Handout 1, Zeus affirms Poseidon's desire previously stated at line 152, megadesphin oros polei amphicolypsi, to envelop the Phaeacian city with a great mountain by repeating the phrase. However, Aristophanes of Byzantium's edition, also in Handout 1, varies slightly and replaces mega with me. Zeus then opposes Poseidon's plan, urging him to avoid committing an overzealously destructive act. How one opines regarding this seemingly innocuous detail has a broad-ranging impact. It alters Homer's theological vision of Poseidon's character, the authorial limitations that govern Zeus and Poseidon's relationship, as well as how prophetic fulfillment may be properly defined. Yet, the following questions add an even more intriguing element to the episode. If Homer purposely leaves the fate of the Phaeacians unresolved, what are his reasons for doing so? Does he intend for there to be an answer to this question, or is it mainly for dramatic effect? While academics have performed careful and significant work on the narratological purposes of the passage discussed in this paper, namely Odyssey Book 13, lines 125 to 187, Alexander Loney's characterization of the Phaeacian episode being, quote, perhaps the most abrupt change of scene in all of Homer, end quote, begs further inquiry into what reaction such a transition may elicit. With that said, I do not pretend to read the minds of Homer's ancient audience, but by approaching the text wielding a grasp of the various ways archaic cult practice personified Poseidon, as well as enactivist theories of imagination and narrative, I hope to demonstrate the ability of this episode to evoke a particularly vivid and embodied response in a listener or reader. Ultimately, I conclude that the brusque change of scene in line 187 produces an example of what I call a character death, that an audience immersed in the narrative intimately experiences. For this sense of immersion to occur and be sustained, an audience must imagine themselves as part of the physical environment housed within the narrative. Homer's particularly expert ability to create this experience has been noted by Jenny Strauss-Clay, who argues that, quote, Homer's complex and dynamic vision is ordered in such a coherent and vivid fashion that we can mentally transport ourselves to the Trojan plain, end quote. In an enactivist model, there's a sense of bodily involvement for an audience member interacting with the narrative, containing both emotional and physical responses. It is important to note that while a person engages in this way, they are not expected to conceptualize every aspect of the literary scene at hand, nor would it be possible for an author to provide such precision of detail. Marco Caracciolo offers a helpful metaphor to understand this experience. Consider this. We have suddenly lost our ability to see, but have retained all our other faculties and have been given a cane. We use this cane to understand our surroundings, making repeated contact with the tangible world while simultaneously employing our senses of hearing and smell to craft a perception of this world that, in Caracciolo's words, quote, is enacted or brought forth through a pattern of meaningful interactions, end quote. Odyssey Book 13 presents several such taps of the cane or enactivist narrational cues. 3 sets of these markers are of extended significance: descriptions of Poseidon's destructive tendencies, the threat to envelop the city of the Phaeacians marked by the repeated use of forms of amphicolypto, to envelop, and finally the use of direct speech by a member of the Phaeacian crowd at Scheria. Before we examine how allusions to Poseidon's destructive tendencies and volatile characteristics may evoke an embodied sense of fear, it is important to demonstrate how this passage, as well as the presentation of Poseidon as a whole in the Odyssey, aligns with archaic Greek theology. I agree here with Richard Martin that Poseidon is not a god of the sea, but rather a god of the interaction between the land and sea. To note Martin's language, Poseidon, quote, embodies the threat of collision, earthquake and tsunami, floods and mountain tossings are his weapons, end quote. Some of Poseidon's most common cult epithets, asphaleos, steadfast, gaiokos, earth-holding, and enosagaios, earth-shaker, all reflect his ability to affect the land, particularly in his power to quell or initiate earthquakes. Turning to the Homeric corpus, asphaleos is notably absent from the list of epithets that illustrate Poseidon's power over nature, which add enosykthon, earthshaker again, to the aforementioned gaiokos and enosagaios. Given that Jennifer Larson shows that the language of asphaleos characterizes Poseidon as pacific, while the other three purvey a sense of destructiveness, the portrayal of the god tends heavily towards his violent attributes in the Odyssey. We may also note that the sea itself during Odysseus' journey through the enchanted realm seems to mirror Poseidon's hostile stance against the hero, or, as in Erwin Cooks's words, quote, we can retrieve the theme of the sea god's wrath from the character of his domain, end quote. Through the ancient Greek audience's presumed intimacy with Poseidon's substantial power and volatility in archaic theology, as well as in previous episodes of the Odyssey, they would understand Poseidon's ability and prerogative to destroy Scheria. Repeated signaling across this episode in Book 13 then may invoke an embodied sense of fear in the audience as they reflect upon their perception of Poseidon. Homer begins to implement a feeling of tension in this episode at line 125, which you'll find under handout number 2. Much like the change of scene that ends the Phaeacian episode at line 187, which is under the same handout to the right for comparison's sake. Excuse me one moment. This shift jarringly disrupts the pleasant image of the homeward-bound Phaeacian ship mid-line. Recalling the description at line 86, Hede malas phaleos thein ampedon, the ship sped along rather surely and steadily, the audience may very well mark Poseidon's arrival as an immediate threat to the safe passage of the ship. Its journey is no longer left unharmed by an absent Pacific and asphaleos Poseidon, but is threatened by Poseidon and Ocycthon. The epithets Homer assigns to Poseidon from his emergence in line 125 up until the departure of the god in line 164 demonstrate the substance and threat of his presence within the narrative. You will find this passage in handout 3. Of the 8 epithets found in the passage, there are 5 mentions of Poseidon's role as Earthshaker, or referring to his power over the earth, which I have highlighted in yellow here, as well as 3 describing his authority more generally, which are found in bold font. While the epithets of general authority are nestled in a mere 3-line section, we can see visually that those describing Poseidon's power over the earth are sprinkled across the passage. Thus, the passage regularly confronting the audience with references to Poseidon and Ocycthon tempers their inaction. We might also note an intensification between lines 159 and 162, with 2 instances of Ocycthon in close proximity, as well as a line-to-line repetitive pair of spatial cues. Hede malas gendon eleuthe pontoporos neus, the seafaring ship drew rather close to Scheria. Tiste gendon elth and Ocycthon, as the Earthshaker drew closer to the ship. Faced with the prospect of destruction drawing ever nearer, spatially and temporally, the audience may then experience a heightened sense of fear for the ship and city. Having established how Homer utilizes Poseidon's epithets in heightening narrative suspense, as well as opening the door to an embodied experience, we may now turn toward the repetition of amphikalupto, which I translate simply as to envelop, in its rarer destructive sense. Beyond Odyssey, Book 13, a quick search of the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae reveals only 2 other instances of amphikalupto or kalupto taking on this sense in Homer or Hesiod, both of which can be found in handout 4. The first, in Iliad Book 12, refers to the destruction of the famed Achaean wall, and the second marks the passing of subsequent generations in a tripartite sequence of a repeated line in Hesiod's Works and Days. Though at first glance these 3 examples seem bound by different contexts, Bernardo Ballesteros convincingly argues that when we evaluate the passages in conjunction, they, quote, speak for a traditional, if situationally restricted, status of amphikalupto as a signal of cosmic destruction, end quote. If Ballesteros is correct, the ancient Greek audience would then understand Poseidon's statement that he wishes to envelop Scheria to be less of an expression of desire and the need for Zeus's approval, and more of a promise to carry out the act. After all, Poseidon seemed quite willing to flout the will of Zeus and help the Achaeans in Book 13 of the Iliad, and there is obviously no physical evidence of the Achaean wall, nor of a living member of the previous Ganos. In the same way, following the traditional formula, Poseidon will envelop the physical proof of the Phaeacians in Scheria, erasing all signs of their previous existence. Amphikalupta may signal destruction on a grand scale, but its use in other pieces of the Homeric corpus expresses the more general meaning of concealment and is readily lendable to metaphors of death or sleep. Telos thanatoio kalupse, the fulfillment of death, covered Patroclus, and auto malakon pericom ekalupsa, Hera gently covered Zeus in a deep sleep. With a vocabulary encompassing both metaphors, it is intriguing that Odysseus' sleeping and waking enwraps the main part of our discussion, which is Poseidon and the Phaeacian episode. The start of his sleep and the description of it at line 79, as well as his waking abruptly in the middle of line 187, are in handout 5. With this intrusive change of scene, the result regarding the destruction of the Phaeacians is of course left unanswered. Yet the narrative chiasmus of Odysseus' sleep and their potential impending doom invites comparison. Just as Odysseus' sleep is nagretos, unwaking, and thanato agesta eokos, closest it seems to death, so too have the Phaeacians reached the nearest point of an unwaking death themselves by line 187. Turning again to the Poseidon and Scheria episode, the use of direct speech by the Phaeacian crowd aids in the enactment of the audience and allows one to vividly imagine their own physical embodiment as a member of said crowd. The passage I refer to is between lines 165 and 170 and is under handout 6. We might think that this enactment as a member of the crowd is made more difficult since there is no identifiable individual being addressed here. Yet, Caracciolo argues that the opposite is true. By embodying an anonymous persona, an unnamed Phaeacian in this case, a narrative allows for, quote, the highest degree of fictionalization of the reader's virtual body, even higher than full-blown characters, end quote. Embodying this anonymous persona, the audience strongly responds to the various cues suggested by the speaker, addressing them. They internalize their close connection to Poseidon and the sea, being Nausiklutoi, famous for their ships. They gaze upon the ship that they observe was once moving swiftly, and I might add asphaleos, steadily, in turning back to line 86, but the vessel is now held fast. Finally, they experience the fear of their impending fate, initially ignorant of what is to come, and then frantically rushing to appease Poseidon via sacrifice in the following section. We have now reached a point in the narrative at which the audience may experience what I term a character death. To clarify what I mean here, my argument is not that the audience has the explicit experience of death in their embodied persona. If this is the case, there is no premise for the rich debate on the conclusion of the Phaeacian episode. Homer would have presented his cues to indicate that Poseidon had indeed fulfilled his wish to kill the Phaeacians. The deed was done. The story is finished. But this is not what happens. The abrupt change of scene in line 187 rips the audience away from Scheria to Ithacan shores, and the Odyssey does not readdress the Phaeacians. What we have is rather a simulation of the experience of death for the audience, from which they emerge completely intact and unharmed. Let me explain. Going back again to handout 5. Narrative darkness swiftly envelops the audience in the middle of line 187 and presents a new environment focalized on a waking Odysseus, reenacting the change of state from consciousness to unconsciousness, unconsciousness to consciousness, that occurs in sleep or death. Odysseus's emergence from the enchanted realm supports this position, as he does not return to it, nor does Poseidon, ruler of this realm, gain further mention in the Odyssey beyond a passing reference in Book 23. The relevance of such matters dissipates with Odysseus's arrival at Ithaca and the quelling of Poseidon's anger after fulfilling Nausithus's prophecy. There is a cosmic shift in line 187, infused with a sense of finality, when Homer violently rips his audience away from the anonymous Phaeacian they embodied. I've intended in this paper to illustrate how the enactivist cues present in Odyssey Book 13, lines 125 to 187, may enable Homer's audience to imagine a highly vivid embodied experience. The repeated characterization of Poseidon having destructive tendencies, as noted by epithets such as anosykthon, earthshaker, may reinforce the fear and unease an ancient Greek audience would feel regarding the Phaeacians' fate. The repetition of amphikalypto, to envelop, acts similarly if we accept Ballesteros' argument that diction may harbor a traditional denotation of looming cosmic destruction in Homer and Hesiod. Beyond its destructive definition, the close ties amphikalypto has with metaphors of sleep and death may also foreshadow this ill fate. Odysseus' sleep, contemporaneous with the episode and encircling it in the narrative structure of Book 13, further highlights this connection. Beyond the induction of fear in the audience, the direct dialogue between the Phaeacians at Scheria encourages the audience to embody an anonymous persona present amongst the crowd and enable a more vivid enactment of the Phaeacians' physical and mental, as well as emotional, experience. Ultimately, the change of scene at line 187 produces an example of character death, where the audience is violently ripped away from their embodied experience of a Phaeacian, facing down the possibility of death themselves. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Maxwell. It was very interesting to hear your speech. Thank you.